Hello, welcome to the Arturia Buchla Easel tutorial series. It's a bit of a mouthful, that one. Today we're dealing with the complex oscillator. This is the heart of the synthesizer. It's the most important sound making source the synth has. Now what I've done is cleared the synthesizer down as much as I possibly can, so it's completely empty. In fact, if I press a key on the keyboard now, the keyboard isn't even attached to the synthesizer. It's completely bare. For the purposes of today, we're only going to worry about the complex oscillator, but in order to hear it, I need to turn some volume up. So I'm going to move this slider, and we're not going to worry about what the dual low-pass gate is. We'll deal with it in a different video, but for today, just treat it like a volume control. This is the oscillator in action. It's generating tone all the time. It's just a question of whether or not we activate a sound source to be able to hear it. And you can see that by default, it's kind of a sine wave, triangle kind of hybrid thing. It's not really anything. It certainly isn't a sine wave. That's its harmonic distribution, it's quite complex. It's obviously not a very interesting sound. We want to add additional harmonic content to it to make it more interesting. How can we do that? Well, there are two fundamental processes that we can use. We can apply wave mixing by bringing a second brand new wave into the equation, and we have a timbre control down here. We'll deal with each of those separately. First things first, wave mixing. Let's get our sound up and running again. And now I'm going to introduce a second wave, and the shape of the wave that's going to be introduced is determined by this timbre switch. It's currently set to triangle. It'll get louder as I turn this dial up. So I'll just turn it down a little bit. There's the triangle, and then as we pull back again, we go back to our original sound. The top setting is called an impulse train. Let's see what that looks like. This is the most complex of the waves. So this impulse train is being mixed with our original wave, and we get the composite wave. And finally, we have a square wave, which when added to our original wave ends up not looking very much like a square wave at all. And there we have it. So an awful lot of flexibility just from that knob and the three different switches on offer to us. In addition to all of that, we have a timbre slider, and what this introduces is a concept called wave folding. Wave folding is a really interesting form of synthesis. It's basically like an additive form of synthesis rather than subtractive, where you use filters to pull things away. With wave folding, we basically introduce new harmonics into the sound. And the way we do it is you set an arbitrary ceiling, a control voltage ceiling beyond which the signal's not allowed to go. If it would go through the ceiling, instead of doing so, it folds back on itself and basically makes an increasingly complex wave that in turn is additional harmonics. And we hear that as interesting tone. Let's see it in action. There's our simple wave. Now as I start to increase this slider, just make it a little bit louder, you'll see the wave temporarily get loud and then begin to fold on itself. So I'll just pause that momentarily. So this is as if I'd carried on making the wave bigger and bigger, louder and louder, introducing additional harmonic content. But when it gets to the stage where it reaches this ceiling, it basically kind of buckles on itself and folds back in. If we get this back up and running again and carry on increasing the timbre, you can see the wave gets folded more and more and more, ever increasingly complex. Getting more and more little wiggles in the wave. Across that entire spectrum, we can also apply the second wave. At different wave shapes. So there's an awful lot of tonal complexity to be had with those two combinations of the dual wave philosophy with the wave folding applied to the composite wave. So that's the basis of our sound. That's why the Buchla Easel is capable of making such rich and interesting tones, because right at its heart it's got this interesting, unusual form of synthesis. Let's have a look at some of the other features of the oscillator. What is this tone that we're hearing? Well, it's a C. Why is it a C? Because I pressed a C on the keyboard. If I press a G, it's going to start playing a G, and it will carry on doing so until it receives a new instruction. Here's an A, and so on and so on. Where's that coming from? Well, the reason why we're hearing chromatic tones is because the oscillator is currently in keyboard mode, which means that every key on the keyboard is being translated into a control voltage. That control voltage is being fed into the oscillator. The oscillator is interpreting that instruction, that size of voltage, as an instruction to generate a signal of a particular frequency. We can decouple the keyboard from the oscillator, and now when we turn the volume slider up, we're going to get a very different sound. And it now doesn't matter what key I play on my keyboard, all the way down, they're all going to generate the same tone. That just happens to be the lowest key I hit on the keyboard. There's a C again. So this enables us to use it really easily as a keyboard. Put it in keyboard mode and we're going to get something that's pretty familiar to us. But of course, an oscillator is just a sound generation module, and so we can decouple it from the keyboard completely and take manual control of the frequency. If I bring the sound back in again, so the last note I played was a C, but now I can start varying the pitch manually using the pitch slider. And you can see it starts out, it says C0. Now as I turn this, move this pitch slider up, can you hear that it's stepping up in semitones? If I kind of let it come to rest at any given time, the tuner is always going to tell us that it's playing a note of a particular pitch. That's because of the quantize switch. Quantize basically means that when I increase the pitch manually using the pitch slider, do so in chromatic jumps. If I turn quantizing off and do the same thing with the pitch slider, now we're going to get a completely smooth increase and decrease. We have a fine-tune knob, which gives us pretty much what it says on the label. I just moved that knob with a left click and drag. If I right click with my mouse, I can move it up in tiny increments. This is true for all controls on Arturia products. Left click, and if I double click, it resets it back to the default position, whatever that may be. Now there are a few controls in the Complex Oscillator I've not dealt with yet. We've got these two with the arrows pointing into them, and we've got the polarity switch. We need a modulation source in order to be able to talk about those three things, and in the next video we'll introduce the envelope generator, which is, guess what, a modulation source. Hope to see you then. Thanks very much for watching. See you next time.